Padre Pio wept only rarely. He had seen countless souls in distress, had witnessed profound suffering, had encountered darkness in forms most people never imagine. But tears came infrequently because his years of spiritual combat had taught him a certain steadiness in the face of pain. So when his fellow friars found him weeping late one night in the chapel, they knew something unusual had occurred. When they asked what had moved him so deeply, he said only this: "I have just encountered a soul that lived 83 years and was never once truly seen." The soul had appeared to him shortly after midnight, an elderly woman, plain in appearance, unremarkable in almost every visible way, the kind of person who moves through crowds without drawing attention, who sits in rooms without commanding notice, who speaks and is somehow not quite heard, not because she was invisible, but because she had learned over decades to take up as little space as possible, to require as little attention as possible, to exist as quietly as possible. And in that progressive diminishment, something essential had been lost, not just from others, but from herself. What made Padre Pio weep was not that she had suffered dramatically. She had not been abused or abandoned in obvious ways. She had not lived in poverty or illness. Her life had been ordinary by most standards. She had family, had friends, had belonged to communities, had been surrounded by people for most of her 83 years. But in all that time, no one had ever truly seen her, not her actual self, not the person beneath the surface, not the interior life she carried. They saw the role she played, the function she served, the pleasant exterior she maintained, but her, the actual her, remained unknown, unwitnessed, invisible, despite being constantly visible. She told Padre Pio that she had not realized this during her life. Or rather, she had felt it, but could not name it. The persistent loneliness that existed even in crowded rooms, the sense of being peripheral even in her own family, the conversations where she spoke, but her words seemed to pass through people without landing, the relationships that felt curiously hollow despite years of proximity. She had attributed this to her own inadequacy, assumed she was simply not interesting enough to hold attention, not compelling enough to be remembered, not significant enough to matter deeply to anyone. But now, in death, with the clarity that comes when all defenses fall away, she saw the truth. It was not that she lacked depth. It was that no one had ever bothered to look for it. People had accepted the surface version she presented, the agreeable, helpful, uncomplicated person she had learned to be, and they had been satisfied with that, had never asked what lived underneath, had never wondered if there was more, had never pursued her past the pleasantries. And slowly, over years, she had stopped offering more, had stopped hoping to be seen, had accepted invisibility as her permanent condition. Padre Pio understood that this invisibility took a specific form. She had been seen in her roles, as daughter, as wife, as mother, as neighbor, as church member. People saw her fulfilling these functions, appreciated when she did them well, noticed when she failed to meet expectations. But the person inhabiting those roles, the consciousness experiencing them, the soul living inside the performance that remained unexamined, unacknowledged, unknown. She was useful, she was functional, She was present, but she was not known. What struck Padre Pio most deeply was how this shaped her understanding of herself. If you are never truly seen, you begin to doubt there is anything worth seeing. If no one ever asks about your interior life, you begin to question whether you have one. If your thoughts go unexpressed because no one invites their expression, you begin to wonder if they matter. And over time, this doubt becomes certainty. The soul concludes that it is exactly as uninteresting as it appears to be, that its invisibility is deserved, that there is nothing beneath the surface worth discovering, and it stops trying to be seen, stops hoping for recognition, accepts its peripheral status as accurate reflection of its actual significance. The woman told Padre Pio about specific moments that illustrated this pattern. Her husband of 47 years, a good man by most measures, faithful, reliable, present. But in nearly 5 decades of marriage, he had never asked her what she thought about things that were not practical, never wondered what she felt beyond surface emotions, never inquired about her interior life. He knew her preferences, her routines, her habits, but her actual self, her private thoughts, her unspoken longings, her questions about existence, these remained foreign to him. Not because he was cruel, but because it never occurred to him to ask. She was there. She functioned. She was stable. That was enough. The person behind the function was irrelevant to the functioning. Her children knew her as mother, the person who cared for them, who anticipated needs, who solved problems, who maintained order. But who she was apart from mothering, they had no idea. They had never asked. Even as adults, their conversations remained surface, transactional, focused on logistics and needs. If she had thoughts about life, about meaning, about her own experience of aging or regret or hope, these were never invited. She was mother. That was her identity. That was all they needed her to be. The person who had once been young, who had dreams before they had children, who had an interior life apart from serving them, that person was invisible. Her friendships followed the same pattern. Decades of association, regular contact, shared activities, but never penetration to depth. The conversations remained pleasant, agreeable, focused on external things, weather, news, shared acquaintances, surface topics that required nothing vulnerable. No one ever asked her the questions that would have revealed her. What do you long for? What do you fear? What do you wonder about in the hours when you cannot sleep? What remains unresolved in you? What have you never said? The questions stayed safe, and safety meant she remained unknown. What made this particularly painful was that she had tried, especially in younger years, to be seen. She had offered glimpses of her interior life, expressed thoughts that went deeper than surface pleasantries, shared feelings that revealed complexity. But these offerings were consistently met with discomfort or dismissal. People changed the subject, minimized what she shared, offered quick reassurances that closed rather than opened conversation. And she learned that people preferred the simple version, the uncomplicated person who did not require them to engage deeply, who did not challenge them to see beyond function, who remained comfortably peripheral. And so she stopped offering, stopped revealing, stopped hoping to be known. and accepted that invisibility was the price of being acceptable. Padre Pio recognized this pattern because he saw it in many souls, particularly in women of that generation, particularly in people taught that their value lay in service rather than personhood, particularly in souls who learned early that being seen required being exceptional, and that ordinary interior lives were not worth examining. These souls became experts at invisibility, at taking up minimal space, at requiring minimal attention, at existing in ways that did not burden others with the complexity of their actual selves. And this expertise, while it made them easy to be around, slowly erased them. What the soul mourned now was not primarily that others had failed to see her, though that was part of it. What she mourned was that she had cooperated in her own erasure, had accepted invisibility as appropriate, had learned to silence herself before others could silence her, had become so skilled at disappearing that even she could no longer find herself. By the time she died, she did not know who she was apart from the roles, did not have language for her interior life because it had gone unexpressed for so long, did not trust that her thoughts mattered because they had been treated as irrelevant for decades. She had become the hollow person others assumed she was, not because she was born hollow, but because being hollow was what was required of her. Padre Pio asked her if she had tried to change this pattern. She said yes. In her 60s, after her children were grown, she had attempted to become more visible, had tried to express more of herself. But by then, the roles were so established, the expectations so fixed, that her attempts at depth were received as disruption. Her family did not know what to do with this version of her. They preferred the familiar mother, the predictable wife, the uncomplicated grandmother. When she tried to be more, to reveal more, to ask for more substantial connection, it made people uncomfortable. They wanted her to return to the comfortable periphery she had always occupied. And eventually, exhausted by the effort of trying to be seen by people who preferred not to see her, she retreated, accepted that it was too late, that she would remain invisible until death. And she did. What Padre Pio wept over was the waste, not waste of potential in worldly terms, but waste of personhood, a soul that had depth, complexity, richness, that lived 83 years without ever being encountered by another human being in its fullness. A person who had thoughts worth hearing that went unheard, feelings worth acknowledging that went unacknowledged, a private interior world that remained private not by choice, but by abandonment. All of that simply discarded, treated as irrelevant, deemed not worth the effort of discovery. And the soul learned to agree with that assessment, learned to see itself as correctly peripheral, correctly simple, correctly invisible. The soul asked Padre Pio if God had seen her, if at least divine sight had witnessed what human sight had missed. And Padre Pio said yes. Of course. God sees all, knows all. Nothing is hidden from divine sight. But the soul's next question revealed the deeper wound. If God saw her, why had God not arranged for humans to see her? Why had God allowed her to live 83 years unwitnessed by the people she lived among? Why had divine sight not translated into human recognition? Padre Pio had no easy answer. He could not explain why God allows some souls to remain hidden while others are seen. could not rationalize the loneliness inherent in invisibility, could only say what he knew to be true, that being seen by God is ultimate, but that humans are made for human connection, for mutual recognition, for the experience of being known by another consciousness like their own. And when that knowing is withheld, when visibility is denied, the soul suffers a particular kind of poverty, not the worst suffering, not the deepest pain, but a grinding, persistent loneliness that shapes everything. A sense of being fundamentally alone, even in proximity, peripheral, even in participation, present, but not encountered. What the soul understood now was that being seen requires two things: someone willing to look, and someone willing to be looked at. Most of her life, she had encountered people unwilling to look. They were content with surfaces, satisfied with functions, comfortable with simplicity. They did not want to engage with complexity, did not want to invest in depth, did not want to take on the responsibility of truly knowing another person. So they did not look, did not ask, did not pursue what lived beneath role and function. And she, worn down by repeated dismissal, had eventually become unwilling to be looked at, had learned to hide, to minimize, to present only what was acceptable, had collaborated in her own invisibility because being invisible was less painful than repeatedly offering depth that no one wanted to receive. Padre Pio said that this pattern is more common than people realize. That many souls live their entire lives never being truly seen, not because they lack depth, not because they are genuinely simple, but because the people around them are not looking, are satisfied with surface, are uncomfortable with complexity. Prefer relationships that do not require much of them, and so souls go unknown, live surrounded by people but essentially alone, participate in communities but remain peripheral, exist visibly but are never actually witnessed. What makes this particularly tragic is that most people do not realize this is happening. The person being overlooked often concludes they are simply not worth seeing. The people doing the overlooking often believe they know the person adequately. Neither recognizes that an entire interior world is going unexplored, that a consciousness is living unwitnessed, that a person is present but not encountered. The invisibility is so normalized, so woven into the fabric of ordinary interaction, that it passes as normal, as acceptable, as just how things are. The soul told Padre Pio that if she could speak to the living, she would say this: look at the people around you, really look. Not at their functions, not at their roles, not at the surface they present. Look for the person underneath. Ask the questions that invite depth. Create space for complexity. Pursue what is hidden, not because it is hidden, but because it is there. Because every person, even the plainest, the quietest, the most apparently simple, has an interior world worth discovering, has thoughts that matter, has feelings that deserve acknowledgement, has a self that longs to be seen. She would tell them that being seen does not require being extraordinary, does not require being fascinating or brilliant or compelling. It requires only that someone care enough to look, to ask, to listen beyond the immediate answer to what lives beneath it, to wonder about the person behind the function, to treat invisibility not as natural, but as something to be overcome. Because invisibility is violence, quiet violence, socially acceptable violence, but violence nonetheless. It erases personhood, denies consciousness, treats a soul as if it were only what it appears to be rather than what it actually is. And she would tell those who feel invisible, as she did, that their invisibility is not proof of their insignificance. That being overlooked does not mean there is nothing worth seeing. That the failure of others to pursue depth does not mean depth does not exist. She would tell them not to cooperate in their own erasure, not to accept peripheral status as deserved, not to silence themselves before others can silence them, to keep offering, keep expressing, keep insisting on their own existence even when that existence is not acknowledged, because the alternative, becoming hollow to match others' expectations, is a kind of death that happens while still breathing. Padre Pio wept that night not just for this one soul, but for all the souls who live unseen, who move through years and decades surrounded by people, yet essentially alone, who long to be known but have learned not to hope for it, who carry interior worlds that remain private not by choice, but by abandonment. He wept for the waste of it, for all the depth that goes undiscovered, for all the personhood that goes unwitnessed, for all the souls who die having never been truly encountered by another human consciousness. And he wept because he knew this pattern would continue, that invisibility would remain common, that people would keep accepting surface connections as sufficient, that souls would keep living unwitnessed lives, that the loneliness of being present but unseen would persist, not because it must, but because most people do not realize it is happening, do not recognize that the quiet person in their life might be hiding not by choice, but by resignation, do not understand that beneath the simple exterior might live a complex interior that no one ever bothered to explore, do not see that visibility requires effort, requires asking, requires caring enough to look beyond what is immediately presented. The soul left Padre Pio's presence, moving toward healing, the long work of purgatory where she would learn to see herself as God saw her, would recover the personhood that invisibility had eroded, would become again, or perhaps for the first time, fully herself. But the grief of having lived 83 years unseen remained, not as condemnation, not as punishment, but as reality, as the truth of what her life had been, surrounded by people, but never truly seen.